Dear friends and students, you are listening to The History of Modern India by Bipin Chandra. Chapter number 4, Expansion of the Empire, 1756 to 1818. British occupation of Bengal. The beginning of British political sway over India may be traced to the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when the English East India Company's forces defeated Siraj ud-Daulah, the Nawab of Bengal. The earlier British struggle with the French in South India had been but a dress rehearsal. The lessons learnt there were profitably applied in Bengal. Bengal was the most fertile and the richest of India's provinces. Its industries and commerce were well developed. As has been noted earlier, the East India Company and its servants had highly profitable trading interests in the province. The company had secured valuable privileges in 1717 under a royal farman by the Mughal emperor, which had granted the company the freedom to export and import their goods in Bengal without paying taxes and the right to issue passes or dastaks for the movement of such goods. The company's servants were also permitted to trade but were not covered by this farman. They were required to pay the same taxes as Indian merchants. This farman was a perpetual source of conflict between the company and the Nawabs of Bengal. For one, it meant loss of revenue to the Bengal government. Secondly, the power to issue dastaks for the company's goods was misused by the company's servants to evade taxes on their private trade. All the Nawabs of Bengal, from Murshid Quli Khan to Aliwardi Khan, had objected to the English interpretation of the Farman of 1717. They had compelled the company to pay lump sums to their treasury and firmly suppressed the misuse of dastaks. The company had been compelled to accept the authority of the Nawabs in the matter, but its servants had taken every opportunity to evade and defy this authority. Matters came to a head in 1756, when the young and quick-tempered Siraj ud-Daulah succeeded his grandfather, Aliwardi Khan. He demanded of the English that they should trade on the same basis as in the time of Murshid Quli Khan. The English refused to comply, as they felt strong after their victory over the French in South India. They had also come to recognize the political and military weakness of Indian states. Instead of agreeing to pay taxes on their goods to the Nawab, they levied heavy duties on Indian goods entering Calcutta, which was under their control. All this naturally annoyed and angered the young Nawab, who also suspected that the company was hostile to him and was favoring his rivals for the throne of Bengal. The breaking point came when, without taking the Nawab's permission, the company began to fortify Calcutta in expectation of the coming struggle with the French, who were stationed at this time at Chandarnagar. Siraj rightly interpreted this action as an attack upon his sovereignty. How could an independent ruler permit a private company of merchants to build forts or to carry on private wars on his land? Moreover, he feared that if he permitted the English and the French to fight each other on the soil of Bengal, he too would meet the fate of the Carnatic Nawabs. In other words, Siraj was willing to let the Europeans remain as merchants, but not as masters. He ordered both the English and the French to demolish their fortifications at Calcutta and Chandarnagar and to desist from fighting each other. While the French company obeyed his order, the English company refused to do so, for its ambition had been whetted and its confidence enhanced by its victories in the Carnatic. It was now determined to remain in Bengal, even against the wishes of the Nawab, and to trade there on its own terms. It had acknowledged the British government's right to control all its activities. It had quietly accepted restrictions on its trade and power imposed in Britain by the British government. Its right to trade with the East had been extinguished by the Parliament in 1693 when its charter was withdrawn. It had paid huge bribes to the King, the Parliament, and the politicians of Britain. In 1 year alone, it had to pay £80,000 in bribes. Nevertheless, the English company demanded the absolute right to trade freely in Bengal, irrespective of the Bengal Nawab's orders. This amounted to a direct challenge to the Nawab's sovereignty. No ruler could possibly accept this position. Siraj ud-Daulah had the statesmanship to see the long-term implications of English designs. He decided to make them obey the laws of the land. Acting with great energy, but with undue haste and inadequate preparation, Siraj ud-Daulah seized the English factory at Kasim Bazaar, marched on to Calcutta, and occupied Fort William on the 20th of June, 1756. He then retired from Calcutta to celebrate his easy victory, letting the English escape with their ships. This was a mistake, for he had underestimated the strength of his enemy. The English officials took refuge at Fulta, near the sea, protected by their naval superiority. Here they waited for aid from Madras and, in the meantime, organized a web of intrigue and treachery with the leading men of the Nawab's court. Chief among these were Mir Jafar, the Mir Bakshi, Manik Chand, the officer in charge of Calcutta, Amir Chand, a rich merchant, Jagat Seth, the biggest banker of Bengal, and Khadim Khan, who commanded a large number of the Nawab's troops. From Madras came a strong naval and military force under Admiral Watson and Colonel Clive. Clive reconquered Calcutta in the beginning of 1757 and compelled the Nawab to concede all the demands of the English. The English, however, were not satisfied. They were aiming high. They had decided to install a more pliant tool in Siraj ud-Daulah's place. Having joined a conspiracy organized by the enemies of the young Nawab to place Mir Jafar on the throne of Bengal, they presented the youthful Nawab with an impossible set of demands. Both sides realized that a war to the finish would have to be fought between them. They met for battle on the field of Plassey, 20 miles from Murshidabad, on 23rd June 1757. The fateful Battle of Plassey was a battle only in name. In all, the English lost 29 men, while the Nawab lost nearly 500. The major part of the Nawab's army, led by the traitors Mir Jafar and Rai Durlab, took no part in the fighting. Only a small group of the Nawab's soldiers, led by Mir Madan and Mohan Lal, fought bravely and well. The Nawab was forced to flee and was captured and put to death by Mir Jafar's son Miran. The Battle of Plassey was followed, in the words of the Bengali poet Bipin Chandra by a night of eternal gloom for India. The English proclaimed Mir Jafar the Nawab of Bengal and set out to gather the reward. The company was granted undisputed right to free trade in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. It also received the zamindari of the 24 Parganas near Calcutta. Mir Jafar paid a sum of 17,700,000 rupees as compensation for the attack on Calcutta to the company and the traders of the city. In addition, he paid large sums as gifts or bribes to the high officials of the company. Clive, for example, received over 2 million rupees, Watts over 1 million. Clive later estimated that the company and its servants had collected more than 30 million rupees from the puppet Nawab. Moreover, it was understood that British merchants and officials would no longer be asked to pay any taxes on their private trade. The Battle of Plassey was of immense historical importance. It paved the way for the British mastery of Bengal and eventually of the whole of India. It boosted British prestige and at a single stroke raised them to the status of a major contender for the Indian Empire. The rich revenues of Bengal enabled them to organize a strong army. Control over Bengal played a decisive role in the Anglo-French struggle. Lastly, the victory of Plassey enabled the company and its servants to amass untold wealth at the cost of the helpless people of Bengal. As the British historians Edward Thompson and G.T. Garrett have remarked, to engineer a revolution had been revealed as the most paying game in the world. A gold lust unequaled since the hysteria that took hold of the Spaniards of Cortes and Pizarro's age filled the English mind. Bengal in particular was not to know peace again until it had been bled white. Even though Mir Jafar owed his position to the company, he soon repented the bargain he had struck. His treasury was soon emptied by the demands of the company's officials for presents and bribes, the lead in the matter being given by Clive himself. As Colonel Malleson has put it, the single aim of the company's officials was to grasp all they could, to use Mir Jafar as a golden sack into which they could dip their hands at pleasure. The company itself was seized with unsurpassable greed. Believing that the Kamdhenu had been found and that the wealth of Bengal was inexhaustible, the directors of the company ordered that Bengal should pay the expenses of the Bombay and Madras presidencies and purchase out of its revenue all the company's exports from India. The company was no longer to merely trade with India. It was to use its control over the Nawab of Bengal to drain the wealth of the province. Mir Jafar soon discovered that it was impossible to meet the full demands of the company and its officials, who, on their part, began to criticize the Nawab for his incapacity in fulfilling their expectations. And so, in October 1760, they forced him to abdicate in favor of his son-in-law, Mir Kasim, who rewarded his benefactors by granting the company the zamindari of the districts of Burdwan, Midnapore, and Chittagong, and giving handsome presents totaling 29 lakhs of rupees to the high English officials. Mir Qasim, however, belied English hopes and soon emerged as a threat to their position and designs in Bengal. He was an able, efficient, and strong ruler, determined to free himself from foreign control. He believed that since he had paid the company and its servants adequately for putting him on the throne, they should now leave him alone to govern Bengal. He realized that a full treasury and an efficient army were essential to maintain his independence. He therefore tried to prevent public disorder, to increase his income by removing corruption from revenue administration, and to raise a modern and disciplined army along European lines. All this was not to the liking of the English. Most of all, they disliked the Nawab's attempts to check the misuse of the Farman of 1717 by the company's servants, who demanded that their goods, whether destined for export or for internal use, should be free of duties. This injured the Indian merchants, as they had to pay taxes from which the foreigners got complete exemption. Moreover, the company's servants illegally sold the dastaks or free passes to friendly Indian merchants, who were thereby able to evade the internal customs duties. These abuses ruined the honest Indian traders through unfair competition and deprived the Nawab of a very important source of revenue. In addition to this, the company and its servants got intoxicated by their newfound power and the dazzling prospects of wealth, and, in their pursuit of riches, began to oppress and ill-treat the officials of the Nawab and the poor people of Bengal. They forced the Indian officials and zamindars to give them presents and bribes. They compelled the Indian artisans, peasants, and merchants to sell their goods cheap and to buy dear from them. People who refused were often flogged or imprisoned. These years have been described by a recent British historian, Percival Spear, as the period of open and unashamed plunder. In fact, the prosperity for which Bengal was renowned was being gradually destroyed. Mir Qasim realized that if these abuses continued, he could never hope to make Bengal strong or free himself of the company's control. He therefore took the drastic step of abolishing all duties on internal trade, thus giving his own subjects a concession that the English had seized by force. But the alien merchants were no longer willing to tolerate equality between themselves and Indians. They demanded the reimposition of duties on Indian traders. The battle was about to be joined again. The truth of the matter was that there could not exist two masters in Bengal. While Mir Qasim believed that he was an independent ruler, the English demanded that he should act as a mere tool in their hands. For had they not put him in power? Mir Qasim was defeated in a series of battles in 1763 and fled to Awadh, where he formed an alliance with Shuja ud-Daulah, the Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, the fugitive Mughal emperor. The three allies clashed with the company's army at Buxar on October 22, 1764, and were thoroughly defeated. This was one of the most decisive battles of Indian history, for it demonstrated the superiority of English arms over the combined army of two of the major Indian powers. It firmly established the British as masters of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and placed Awadh at their mercy. Clive, who had returned to Bengal in 1765 as its governor, decided to seize the chance of power in Bengal and to gradually transfer the authority of government from the Nawab to the company. In 1763, the British had restored Mir Jafar as Nawab and collected huge sums for the company and its high officials. On Mir Jafar's death, placed his second son, Nizam ud-Daulah, on the throne, and as a reward, made him sign a new treaty on February 20th, 1765. By this treaty, the Nawab was to disband most of his army and to administer Bengal through a deputy Subadar, who was to be nominated by the company and who could not be dismissed without its approval. The company thus gained supreme control over the administration or Nizamat of Bengal. The members of the Bengal Council of the company once again extracted nearly 15 lakhs of rupees from the new Nawab. From Shah Alam II, who was still the titular head of the Mughal Empire, the company secured the Diwani, or the right to collect revenue, of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Thus, its control over Bengal was legalized, and the revenues of this most prosperous of Indian provinces placed at its command. In return, the company gave him a subsidy of 2.6 million rupees and secured for him the districts of Kora and Allahabad. The emperor resided in the fort of Allahabad for 6 years as a virtual prisoner of the English. The Nawab of Awadh, Shuja ud-Daulah, was made to pay a war indemnity of 5 million rupees to the company. Moreover, the two signed an alliance by which the company promised to support the Nawab against an outside attack, provided he paid for the services of the troops sent to his aid. This alliance made the Nawab a dependent of the company. The Nawab welcomed the alliance in the false belief that the company, being primarily a trading body, was a transitory power, while the Marathas and the Afghans were his real enemies. This was to prove a costly mistake, for both Awadh and the rest of the country. On the other hand, the British had very shrewdly decided to consolidate their acquisition of Bengal and, in the meanwhile, to use Awadh as a buffer or barrier state between their possessions and the Marathas. Dual system of administration of Bengal. The East India Company became the real master of Bengal at least from 1765. Its army was in sole control of its defense, and the supreme political power was in its hands. The Nawab depended for his internal and external security on the British. As the Diwan, the company directly collected its revenues, while through the right to nominate the deputy Subadar, it controlled the Nizamat, or the police and judicial powers. The virtual unity of the two branches of government under British control was signified by the fact that the same person acted in Bengal as the deputy Diwan on behalf of the company and as deputy Subadar on behalf of the Nawab. This arrangement is known in history as the dual or double government. It held a great advantage for the British. They had power without responsibility. They controlled the finances of the province and its army directly, and its administration indirectly. The Nawab and his officials had the responsibility of administration, but not the power to discharge it. The weaknesses of the government could be blamed on the Indians, while its fruits were gathered by the British. The consequences for the people of Bengal were disastrous. Neither the company nor the Nawab cared for their welfare. In any case, the Nawab's officials had no power to protect the people from the greed and rapacity of the company and its servants. On the other hand, they were themselves in a hurry to exploit their official powers. The company's servants had now the whole of Bengal to themselves, and their oppression of the people increased greatly. We can quote Clive himself. I shall only say that such a scene of anarchy, confusion, bribery, corruption, and extortion was never seen or heard of in any country but Bengal, nor such and so many fortunes acquired in so unjust and rapacious a manner. The three provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, producing a clear revenue of £3 million sterling, have been under the absolute management of the company's servants ever since Mir Jafar's restoration to the Subadarship. And they have, both civil and military, exacted and levied contributions from every man of power and consequence, from the Nawab down to the lowest zamindar. The company's authorities, on their part, set out to gather the rich harvest and drain Bengal of its wealth. They stopped sending money from England to purchase Indian goods. Instead, they purchased these goods from the revenues of Bengal and sold them abroad. These were known as the company's investment and formed a part of its profits. On top of all this, the British government wanted its share of the rich prize and, in 1767, ordered the company to pay it £400,000 per year. In the years 1766, 1767, and 1768 alone, nearly £5.7 million were drained from Bengal. The abuses of the dual government and the drain of wealth led to the impoverishment and exhaustion of that unlucky province. In 1770, Bengal suffered from a famine which, in its effects, proved one of the most terrible famines known in human history. People died in lakhs, and nearly one-third of Bengal's population fell victim to its ravages. Though the famine was due to failure of rains, its effects were heightened by the company's policies. Wars under Warren Hastings, 1772 to 1785, and Cornwallis, 1786 to 1793. The East India Company had by 1772 become an important Indian power, and its directors in England and its officials in India set out to consolidate their control over Bengal before beginning a new round of conquests. However, their habit of interfering in the internal affairs of the Indian states and their lust for territory and money soon involved them in a series of wars. In 1766, they entered into an alliance with the Nizam of Hyderabad to help him in attacking Hyder Ali of Mysore in return for the cession of the northern Sarkars. But Hyder Ali was more than a match for the company's armies. Having beaten back the British attack, he threatened Madras in 1769 and forced the Madras Council to sign peace on his terms. Both sides restored each other's conquests and promised mutual help in case of attack by a third party. But when Hyder Ali was attacked by the Marathas in 1771, the English went back on their promise and did not come to his help. This led Hyder Ali to distrust and dislike them. Then, in 1775, the English clashed with the Marathas. An intense struggle for power was taking place at that time among the Marathas between the supporters of the infant Peshwa Madhav Rao II, led by Nana Phadnis, and Raghunath Rao. The British officials in Bombay decided to take advantage of this struggle by intervening on behalf of Raghunath Rao. They hoped thus to repeat the exploits of their countrymen in Madras and Bengal and reap the consequent monetary advantages. This involved them in a long war with the Marathas, which lasted from 1775 to 1782. In the beginning, the Marathas defeated the British forces at Talegaon and forced them to sign the Convention of Wadgaon, by which the English renounced all their conquests and gave up the cause of Raghunath Rao. But the war was soon resumed. It was a dark hour indeed for the British. The Maratha chiefs were united behind the Peshwa and his chief minister, Nana Phadnis. The southern Indian powers had long been resentful of the presence of the British among them, and Hyder Ali and the Nizam chose this moment to declare war upon the company. Thus, the British were faced with the powerful combination of the Marathas, Mysore, and Hyderabad. Moreover, abroad, they were waging a losing war in their colonies in America, where the people had rebelled in 1776. They had also to counter the determined design of the French to exploit the difficulties of their old rival. The British in India were, however, led at this time by their brilliant, energetic, and experienced Governor-General, Warren Hastings. Acting with firm resolve and determination, he retrieved the vanishing British power and prestige. A British force under Goddard marched across central India in a brilliant military maneuver and after a series of victorious engagements reached Ahmedabad, which he captured in 1780. The English had found in the Marathas a determined enemy with immense resources. Mahaji Scindia had given evidence of his power, which the English dreaded to contest. Neither side won victory, and the war had come to a standstill. With the intercession of Mahaji, peace was concluded in 1782 by the Treaty of Salbai, by which the status quo was maintained. It saved the British from the combined opposition of Indian powers. This war, known in history as the First Anglo-Maratha War, did not end in victory for either side. But it did give the British 20 years of peace with the Marathas, the strongest Indian power of the day. The British utilized this period to consolidate their rule over the Bengal presidency, while the Maratha chiefs frittered away their energy in bitter mutual squabbles. Moreover, the Treaty of Salbai enabled the British to exert pressure on Mysore as the Marathas promised to help them in recovering their territories from Hyder Ali. Once again, the British had succeeded in dividing the Indian powers. War with Hyder Ali had started in 1780. Repeating his earlier exploits, Hyder Ali inflicted one defeat after another on the British armies in the Carnatic and forced them to surrender in large numbers. He soon occupied almost the whole of the Carnatic. But once again, British arms and diplomacy saved the day. Warren Hastings bribed the Nizam with the cession of Guntur district and gained his withdrawal from the anti-British alliance. During 1781 to 82, he made peace with the Marathas and thus freed a large part of his army for use against Mysore. In July 1781, the British army under Eyre Coote defeated Hyder Ali at Porto Novo and saved Madras. After Hyder Ali's death in December 1782, the war was carried on by his son, Tipu Sultan. Since neither side was capable of overpowering the other, peace was signed by them in March 1784, and both sides restored all conquests. Thus, though the British had been shown to be too weak to defeat either the Marathas or Mysore, they had certainly proved their ability to hold their own in India. Not only had they been saved from extinction in the south, they had emerged from their recent wars as one of the three great powers in India. The third British encounter with Mysore was more fruitful from the British point of view. The Peace of 1784 had not removed the grounds for struggle between Tipu and the British. It had merely postponed the struggle. The authorities of the East India Company were acutely hostile to Tipu. They looked upon him as their most formidable rival in the south and as the chief obstacle standing between them and complete domination over South India. Tipu, on his part, thoroughly disliked the English, saw them as the chief danger to his own independence, and nursed the ambition to expel them from India. War between the two again began in 1789 and ended in Tipu's defeat in 1792. Even though Tipu fought with exemplary bravery, Lord Cornwallis, the then Governor-General, had succeeded through shrewd diplomacy in isolating him by winning over the Marathas, the Nizam, and the rulers of Travancore and Coorg. This war again revealed that the Indian powers were short-sighted enough to aid the foreigner against another Indian power for the sake of temporary advantages. By the Treaty of Seringapatam, Tipu ceded half of his territories to the Allies and paid 330 lakhs of rupees as indemnity. The Third Anglo-Mysore War destroyed Tipu's dominant position in the south and firmly established British supremacy there. Expansion under Lord Wellesley, 1798 to 1805. The next large-scale expansion of British rule in India occurred during the Governor-Generalship of Lord Wellesley, who came to India in 1798 at a time when the British were locked in a life and death struggle with France all over the world. Till then, the British had followed the policy of consolidating their gains and resources in India and making territorial gains only when this could be done safely without antagonizing the major Indian powers. Lord Wellesley decided that the time was ripe for bringing as many Indian states as possible under British control. By 1797, the two strongest Indian powers, Mysore and the Marathas, had declined in power. The Third Anglo-Mysore War had reduced Mysore to a mere shadow of its recent greatness, and the Marathas were dissipating their strength in mutual intrigues and wars. In other words, political conditions in India were propitious for a policy of expansion. Aggression was easy as well as profitable. Moreover, the trading and industrial classes of Britain desired further expansion in India. Hitherto, they had favored a policy of peace in the belief that war was injurious to trade. But by the end of the 18th century, they had come to think that British goods would sell in India on a large scale only when the entire country had come under British control. The company too was in favor of such a policy, provided it could be pursued successfully and without adversely affecting its profits. Finally, the British in India were determined to keep French influence from penetrating India and therefore to curb and crush any Indian state which might try to have dealings with France. The security of the company's dominion in India was threatened by the impending invasion of Zaman Shah, the ruler of Kabul, who could expect support from the Indian chiefs in northern India and who was invited by Tipu to join in a concerted effort to oust the British from this country. To achieve his political aims, Wellesley relied on three methods: the system of subsidiary alliances, outright wars, and assumption of the territories of previously subordinated rulers. While the practice of helping an Indian ruler with a paid British force was quite old, it was given a definite shape by Wellesley, who used it to subordinate the Indian states to the paramount authority of the company. Under his subsidiary alliance system, the ruler of the allying Indian state was compelled to accept the permanent stationing of a British force within his territory and to pay a subsidy for its maintenance. All this was done allegedly for his protection, but was, in fact, a form through which the Indian ruler paid tribute to the company. Sometimes the ruler ceded part of his territory instead of paying an annual subsidy. The subsidiary treaty also usually provided that the Indian ruler would agree to the posting at his court of a British resident, that he would not employ any European in his service without the approval of the British, and that he would not negotiate with any other Indian ruler without consulting the Governor-General. In return, the British undertook to defend the ruler from his enemies. They also promised non-interference in the internal affairs of the allied state, but this was a promise they seldom kept. In reality, by signing a subsidiary alliance, an Indian state virtually signed away its independence. It lost the right of self-defense, of maintaining diplomatic relations, of employing foreign experts, and of settling its disputes with its neighbors. In fact, the Indian ruler lost all vestiges of sovereignty in external matters and became increasingly subservient to the British resident, who interfered in the day-to-day administration of the state. In addition, the system tended to bring about the internal decay of the protected state. The cost of the subsidiary force provided by the British was very high and, in fact, much beyond the paying capacity of the state. The payment of the arbitrarily fixed and artificially inflated subsidy invariably disrupted the economy of the state and impoverished its people. The subsidiary alliance system also disbanded the armies of the protected states. thousands of soldiers and officers were deprived of their hereditary livelihood, spreading misery and degradation in the country. Many of them joined the bands of Pindaris, which were to ravage the whole of India during the first 2 decades of the 19th century. Moreover, the rulers of the protected states tended to neglect the interests of their people and to oppress them as they no longer feared them. They had no incentive to be good rulers, as they were fully protected by the British from domestic and foreign enemies. The subsidiary alliance system was, on the other hand, extremely advantageous to the British. They could now maintain a large army at the cost of the Indian states. They were enabled to fight wars far away from their own territories, since any war would occur in the territories either of the British ally or of the British enemy. They controlled the defense and foreign relations of the protected state and had a powerful force stationed at the very heart of its lands, and could therefore, at a time of their choosing, overthrow him and annex his territories, declaring him to be inefficient. As far as the British were concerned, the system of subsidiary alliances was, in the words of a British writer, a system of fattening allies as we fatten oxen till they were worthy of being devoured. Lord Wellesley signed his first subsidiary treaty with the Nizam of Hyderabad in 1798. The Nizam was to dismiss his French-trained troops and to maintain a subsidiary force of 6 battalions at a cost of £240,000 per year. In return, the British guaranteed his state against Maratha encroachments. By another treaty in 1800, the subsidiary force was increased, and in lieu of cash payment, the Nizam ceded part of his territories to the company. The Nawab of Awadh was forced to sign a subsidiary treaty in 1801. In return for a larger subsidiary force, the Nawab was made to surrender to the British nearly half of his kingdom, consisting of Rohilkhand and the territory lying between the Ganga and the Jamuna. Moreover, the Nawab was no longer to be independent, even within the part of Awadh left with him. He must accept any advice or order from the British authorities regarding the internal administration of his state. His police was to be reorganized under the control and direction of British officers. His own army was virtually liquidated, and the British had the right to station their troops in any part of his state. Wellesley dealt with Mysore, Carnatic, Tanjore, and Surat even more sternly. Tipu of Mysore would, of course, never agree to a subsidiary treaty. On the contrary, he had never reconciled himself to the loss of half of his territory in 1792. He worked incessantly to strengthen his forces for the inevitable struggle with the British. He entered into negotiations for an alliance with revolutionary France. He sent missions to Afghanistan, Arabia, and Turkey to forge an anti-British alliance. Lord Wellesley was no less determined to bring Tipu to heel and to prevent any possibility of the French re-entering India. The British army attacked and defeated Tipu in a brief but fierce war in 1799, before French help could reach him. Tipu still refused to beg for peace on humiliating terms. He proudly declared that it was better to die like a soldier than to live a miserable dependent on the infidels in the list of their pensioned Rajas and Nabobs. He met a hero's end on the 4th of May 1799, while defending his capital, Seringapatam. His army remained loyal to him to the very end. The taking over of the capital was described by Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, in the following words: "Nothing, therefore, can have exceeded what was done on the night of the 4th. Scarcely a house in the town was left unplundered, and I understand that in camp jewels of the greatest value, bars of gold, etc., etc., have been offered for sale in the bazaars of the army by our soldiers, sepoys, and followers." They, the people, are returning to their houses and beginning again to follow their occupations. But the property of everyone is gone. Nearly half of Tipu's dominions were divided between the British and their ally, the Nizam. The reduced kingdom of Mysore was restored to the descendants of the original Rajas from whom Hyder Ali had seized power. A special treaty of subsidiary alliance was imposed on the new Raja, by which the Governor-General was authorized to take over the administration of the state in case of necessity. Mysore was, in fact, made a complete dependency of the company. An important result of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War was the complete elimination of the French threat to British supremacy in India. In 1801, Lord Wellesley forced a new treaty upon the puppet Nawab of Carnatic, compelling him to cede his kingdom to the company in return for a handsome pension. The Madras Presidency, as it existed till 1947, was now created by attaching the Carnatic to territories seized from Mysore, including the Malabar. Similarly, the territories of the rulers of Tanjore and Surat were taken over and their rulers pensioned off. The Marathas were the only major Indian power left outside the sphere of British control. Wellesley now turned his attention towards them and began aggressive interference in their internal affairs. The Maratha Empire at this time consisted of a confederacy of 5 big chiefs, namely the Peshwa at Pune, the Gaikwad at Baroda, the Scindia at Gwalior, the Holkar at Indore, and the Bhosle at Nagpur, the Peshwa being the nominal head of the confederacy. Unfortunately for the Marathas, they lost nearly all of their wise and experienced leaders towards the close of the 18th century. Mahadji Scindia, Tukoji Holkar, Ahilyabai Holkar, Savai Madhav Rao II, and Nana Phadnis, the man who had kept the Maratha Confederacy together for the last 30 years, were all dead by the year 1800. What was worse, the Maratha chiefs were engaged in bitter fratricidal strife, blind to the real danger from the rapidly advancing foreigner. Yeshwantrao Holkar on one side and Daulatrao Scindia and Peshwa Baji Rao II on the other were locked in mortal combat. Wellesley had repeatedly offered a subsidiary alliance to the Peshwa and Scindia, but the far-sighted Nana Phadnis had refused to fall into the trap. However, when on 25th October 1802, the day of the great festival of Diwali, Holkar defeated the combined armies of the Peshwa and Scindia, the cowardly Peshwa Baji Rao II rushed into the arms of the English, and on the fateful last day of 1802, signed the subsidiary treaty at Bassein. The British had finally realized their ambition. Lord Wellesley wrote on 24th December 1802. This crisis of affairs appeared to me to afford the most favorable opportunity for the complete establishment of the interests of the British power in the Maratha Empire, without the hazard of involving us in a contest with any party. The victory had been a little too easy, and Wellesley was wrong in one respect. The proud Maratha chiefs would not surrender their tradition of independence without a struggle. But even in this moment of their peril, they would not unite against their common enemy. When Scindia and Bhonsle fought the British, Holkar stood on the sidelines, and Gaikwad gave help to the British. When Holkar took up arms, Bhonsle and Scindia nursed their wounds. Moreover, the Maratha chiefs underestimated the enormously increased strength of the enemy and went into battle without adequate preparation. In the south, the British armies led by Arthur Wellesley defeated the combined armies of Scindia and Bhonsle at Assaye in September 1803 and at Argaon in November. In the north, Lord Lake routed Scindia's army at Laswari on the 1st of November and occupied Aligarh, Delhi and Agra. Once again, the blind Emperor of India became a pensioner of the company. The Maratha allies had to sue for peace. Both became subsidiary allies of the company. They ceded part of their territories to the British, admitted British residents to their courts, and promised not to employ any Europeans without British approval. The British gained complete control over the Orissa coast and the territories between the Ganga and the Jamuna. The Peshwa became a disgruntled puppet in their hands. Wellesley now turned his attention towards Holkar, but Yeshwantrao Holkar proved more than a match for the British. Using traditional Maratha tactics of mobile warfare and in alliance with the Jats, he fought British armies to a standstill. Holkar's ally, the Raja of Bharatpur, inflicted heavy losses on Lake, who unsuccessfully attempted to storm his fort. Moreover, overcoming his age-old antagonism to the Holkar family, Scindia began to think of joining hands with Holkar. On the other hand, the shareholders of the East India Company discovered that the policy of expansion through war was proving costly and was reducing their profits. The company's debt had increased from £17 million in 1797 to £31 million in 1806. Moreover, Britain's finances were getting exhausted at a time when Napoleon was once again becoming a major threat in Europe. British statesmen and the directors of the company felt that the time had come to check further expansion, to put an end to ruinous expenditure, and to digest and consolidate Britain's recent gains in India. Wellesley was therefore recalled from India, and the company made peace with Holkar in January 1806 by the Treaty of Rajghat, giving back to the latter the greater part of his territories. Wellesley's expansionist policy had been checked near the end. All the same, it had resulted in the East India Company becoming the paramount power in India. A young officer in the company's judicial service, Henry Robert Claw, could write about 1805. An Englishman in India is proud and tenacious. He feels himself a conqueror amongst a vanquished people, and looks down with some degree of superiority on all below him. Expansion under Lord Hastings. The Second Anglo-Maratha War had shattered the power of the Maratha chiefs, but not their spirit. The loss of their freedom rankled in their hearts. They made a desperate last attempt to regain their independence and old prestige in 1817. The lead in organizing a united front of the Maratha chiefs was taken by the Peshwa, who was smarting under the rigid control exercised by the British resident. However, once again, the Marathas failed to evolve a concerted and well-thought-out plan of action. The Peshwa attacked the British residency at Poona in November 1817. Appa Sahib of Nagpur attacked the residency at Nagpur, and Madhav Rao Holkar made preparations for war. The Governor-General, Lord Hastings, struck back with characteristic vigor. He compelled Scindia to accept British suzerainty and defeated the armies of the Peshwa, Bhonsle, and Holkar. The Peshwa was dethroned and pensioned off at Bithur near Kanpur. His territories were annexed, and the enlarged Presidency of Bombay was brought into existence. Holkar and Bhonsle accepted subsidiary forces. All the Maratha chiefs had to cede to the company large tracts of their territories. To satisfy Maratha pride, the small kingdom of Satara was founded out of the Peshwa's lands and given to the descendant of Chhatrapati Shivaji, who ruled it as a complete dependent of the British. Like other rulers of Indian states, the Maratha chiefs too existed from now on at the mercy of the British power. The Rajputana states had been dominated for several decades by Scindia and Holkar. After the downfall of the Marathas, they lacked the energy to reassert their independence and readily accepted British supremacy. Thus, by 1818, the entire Indian subcontinent, excepting the Punjab and Sindh, had been brought under British control. Part of it was ruled directly by the British, and the rest by a host of Indian rulers over whom the British exercised paramount power. These states had virtually no armed forces of their own, nor did they have any independent foreign relations. They paid heavily for the British forces stationed in their territories to control them. They were autonomous in their internal affairs, but even in this respect, they acknowledged British authority wielded through a resident. They were on perpetual probation. On the other hand, the British were now free to reach out to the natural frontiers of India. The consolidation of British power, 1818 to 57. The British completed the task of conquering the whole of India from 1818 to 1857. Sindh and the Punjab were conquered, and Awadh, the central provinces, and a large number of other petty states were annexed. The Conquest of Sindh. The conquest of Sindh occurred as a result of the growing Anglo-Russian rivalry in Europe and Asia, and the consequent British fears that Russia might attack India through Afghanistan or Persia. To counter Russia, the British government decided to increase its influence in Afghanistan and Persia. It further felt that this policy could be successfully pursued only if Sindh was brought under British control. The commercial possibilities of the river Indus were an additional attraction. The roads and rivers of Sindh were opened to British trade by a treaty in 1832. The chiefs of Sindh, known as Amirs, were made to sign a subsidiary treaty in 1839. And finally, in spite of previous assurances that its territorial integrity would be respected, Sindh was annexed in 1843 after a brief campaign by Sir Charles Napier, who had earlier written in his diary, "We have no right to seize Sindh, yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful, humane piece of rascality it will be." He received 7 lakhs of rupees as prize money for accomplishing the task. The Conquest of the Punjab. The death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in June 1839 was followed by political instability and rapid changes of government in the Punjab. Selfish and corrupt leaders came to the front. Ultimately, power fell into the hands of the brave and patriotic, but utterly undisciplined army. This led the British to look greedily across the Sutlej upon the land of the 5 rivers. Even though they had signed a treaty of perpetual friendship with Ranjit Singh in 1809. The British officials increasingly talked of having to wage a campaign in the Punjab. The Punjab army let itself be provoked by the warlike actions of the British and their intrigues with the corrupt chiefs of the Punjab. In November 1844, Major Broadfoot, who was known to be hostile to the Sikhs, was appointed the British agent in Ludhiana. Broadfoot repeatedly indulged in hostile actions and provocations. The corrupt chiefs and officials found that the army would sooner or later deprive them of their power, position, and possessions. They conceived the idea of saving themselves by embroiling the army in a war with the British. In the autumn of 1845, news reached that boats designed to form bridges had been dispatched from Bombay to Firozepur on the Sutlej. Barracks for additional troops were built in the forward area, and additional regiments began to be dispatched to the frontier with the Punjab. The Punjab army, now convinced that the British were determined to occupy the Punjab, took countermeasures. When it heard in December that Lord Gough, the commander-in-chief, and Lord Hardinge, the governor-general, were marching towards Firozepur, it decided to strike. War between the two was thus declared on the 13th of December, 1845. The danger from the foreigner immediately united the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Sikhs. The Punjab army fought heroically and with exemplary courage. But some of its leaders already turned traitors. The Prime Minister, Raja Lal Singh, and the Commander-in-Chief, Misr Tej Singh, was secretly corresponding with the enemy. The Punjab army was forced to concede defeat and to sign the humiliating Treaty of Lahore on the 8th of March, 1846. The British annexed the Jalandhar Doab and handed over Jammu and Kashmir to Raja Gulab Singh Dogra for a cash payment of 5 million rupees. The Punjab army was reduced to 20,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, and a strong British force was stationed at Lahore. Later, on December 16, 1846, another treaty was signed giving the British resident at Lahore full authority over all matters in every department of the state. Moreover, the British were permitted to station their troops in any part of the state. From now on, the British resident became the real ruler of the Punjab, which lost its independence and became a vassal state. But the aggressively imperialist sections of the British officialdom in India were still unsatisfied, for they wanted to impose direct British rule over the Punjab. Their opportunity came in 1848, when the freedom-loving Punjabis rose up in numerous local revolts. Two of the prominent revolts were led by Mulraj at Multan and Chattar Singh Attariwala near Lahore. The Punjabis were once again decisively defeated. Lord Dalhousie seized this opportunity to annex the Punjab. Thus, the last independent state of India was absorbed into the British Empire in India. Dalhousie and the policy of annexation, 1848 to 1856. Lord Dalhousie came out to India as the Governor-General in 1848. He was from the beginning determined to extend direct British rule over as large an area as possible. He had declared that the extinction of all native states of India is just a question of time. The ostensible reason for this policy was his belief that British administration was far superior to the corrupt and oppressive administration of the native rulers. However, the underlying motive of this policy was the expansion of British exports to India. Dalhousie, in common with other aggressive imperialists, believed that British exports to the native states of India were suffering because of the maladministration of these states by their Indian rulers. Moreover, they thought that their Indian allies had already served the purpose of facilitating British conquest of India and could now be got rid of profitably. The chief instrument through which Lord Dalhousie implemented his policy of annexation was the Doctrine of Lapse. Under this doctrine, when the ruler of a protected state died without a natural heir, his state was not to pass to an adopted heir as sanctioned by the age-old tradition of the country. Instead, it was to be annexed to the British dominions unless the adoption had been clearly approved earlier by the British authorities. Many states, including Satara in 1848 and Nagpur and Jhansi in 1854, were annexed by applying this doctrine. Dalhousie also refused to recognize the titles of many ex-rulers or to pay their pensions. Thus, the titles of the Nawabs of Karnataka and of Surat and the Raja of Tanjore were extinguished. Similarly, after the death of the ex-Peshwa Baji Rao II, who had been made the Raja of Bithur, Dalhousie refused to extend his pay or pension to his adopted son, Nana Sahib. Lord Dalhousie was keen on annexing the kingdom of Awadh, but the task presented certain difficulties. For one, the Nawabs of Awadh had been British allies since the Battle of Buxar. Moreover, they had been most obedient to the British over the years. The Nawab of Awadh had many heirs and could not therefore be targeted by the doctrine of lapse. Some other pretext had to be found for depriving him of his dominions. Finally, Lord Dalhousie hit upon the idea of alleviating the plight of the people of Awadh. Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was accused of having misgoverned his state and of refusing to introduce reforms. His state was therefore annexed in 1856. Undoubtedly, the degeneration of the administration of Awadh was a painful reality for its people. The Nawabs of Awadh, like other princes of the day, were selfish rulers absorbed in self-indulgence, who cared little for good administration or for the welfare of the people. But the responsibility for this state of affairs was in part that of the British, who had at least since 1801 controlled and indirectly governed Awadh. In reality, it was the immense potential of Awadh as a market for Manchester goods which excited Dalhousie's greed and aroused his philanthropic feelings. And for similar reasons, to satisfy Britain's growing demand for raw cotton, Dalhousie took away the cotton-producing province of Berar from the Nizam in 1853. It needs to be clearly understood that the question of the maintenance or annexation of the native states was of no great relevance at this time. In fact, there were no truly independent Indian states in existence at that time. The protected native states were as much a part of the British Empire as the territories ruled directly by the company. If the form of British control over some of these states was changed, it was to suit British convenience. The interests of their people had little to do with the change. Exercises 1. What were the causes of the war between the East India Company and Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah? 2. How was the Battle of Plassey fought? What were its consequences? 3. Discuss the clash between Mir Kasim and the East India Company. 4. Trace the course of British wars with Mysore. 5. Discuss the underlying factors and forces of Wellesley's policy of expansion. What were the basic methods he used to achieve his aims? 6. How did the British overpower the Maratha Confederacy? 7. Examine the policy of conquest and annexations followed by Dalhousie. 8. Write short notes on A. Mir Jafar, B. Clive, C. The dual government of Bengal, D. Annexation of Sindh, E. Annexation of Awadh. Dear friends and students, you are listening to The History of Modern India by Bipin Chandra. Thank you for listening. Let's meet in the next episode.